All right, everybody, welcome back to HR Heretics. Today we have Vijay Pendakur on the show. Now, Vijay, a mutual friend introduced us on a comment thread on LinkedIn. Tell us about how you ended up in the DEI space and some of the work you've done.
Sure. That's just such a 2024, intro, right? Like we met on a comment thread on LinkedIn. At some point in time, we have to meet in 3D in order to fix this. So, a little bit about me, background. I started in DEI work in 2002. So it is a through line in my career. I started in this work in higher education and worked at 5 universities, ending my time as the Dean of Students and Presidential Advisor for Diversity at Cornell. And then I moved into corporate work and held senior HR roles focused on talent and culture at Zynga and VMware and Dropbox and Salesforce. And then I moved into my own solopreneurship, consultancy, fractional work around kind of core issues in employee experience. And I focus on keynote speaking and team effectiveness coaching, high performing teams work mostly these days.
And so today is August 8th, 2024. And I would say that we're in the middle of a very interesting moment for the DEI space. There's significant pushback that we're feeling on all ends of the spectrum, from political leaders to tech leaders to, you go onto Twitter, which is one of the most toxic places on earth, and some of these comment threads there I think are significantly worse than the one that you and I are on in LinkedIn. Now, it seems that after a decade of significant investment, billions of dollars in annual investment, tech teams are now cutting DEI. Colleges are abandoning DEI mission statements, and we're seeing just this pushback everywhere, including in DC. We also recently saw that SHRM, which is one of the biggest HR professional groups in the space, recently removed the term equity from DEI. What's your take on all of this?
Oh, well, let's start with the light stuff, huh? So, I love this question. And I think for me, there's so much bundled into this question, Kelly, Nolan, that one of the things that I think is helpful here is really go micro to macro. And I want to clean up some of the signal versus the noise, right? Because part of the challenge in having a coherent discussion on anything that touches DEI in this moment in time is that the signal fidelity is terrible, right? So let's look at where there's signal and where there's noise. I think that the framing of billions of dollars and a decade of investment could be more accurately tightened up to wavering investment, depending on sector, maybe going back 10 years, right? So some organizations, if you think about 2013, Lean In comes out, Sheryl Sandberg's book, and particularly in Silicon Valley, there was a moment, right? And when you look at the adoption and the organizations that leaned in, to be tongue in cheek about it, we're really talking about very disparate levels, right? Of who cared, frankly, at this moment. And then you see this inflection point in 2020. I think in terms of spend, I haven't seen the receipts on the billions, but I do think a lot of money has been spent, particularly in tech. And so I think a tighter signal is in 2.5 years between 2020 and halfway, maybe close to 2023, tech got really interested in spending money in DEI before pulling back heavily on DEI. And I think it's important to frame the time commitment, because what it does is it sort of focuses the conversation on how much time does it take to address systemic unfairness when corporations are really downstream of the thing they're trying to intervene in, right? So DEI, we talk about it in terms of workplace mechanics, but really it's a complex set of variables. And corporations who are trying to look at hiring, employee experience, social impact, they're downstream of a bunch of social forces that took hundreds of years to create and perpetuate and maintain. And so when we say like, hey, look, corporations spent 2.5 years and hundreds of millions of dollars, what do you think about that? I'm like, great, we're just getting started, is one way of framing this. And I know that that's dissonant with where the popular conversation is now, but I think it's really important to ground this historically. If we're talking about intervening in systemic unfairness, then how many years is reasonable? I think is a fair question to ask. You also mentioned that this is sort of a multi-sector conflagration we're in right now. when people talk about colleges or higher education pulling back on DEI, this is near and dear to my heart as, somebody who worked as a social scientist and a higher education administrator for almost 20 years. I think also clean signal here. Colleges and universities in Republican-dominated states that have passed anti-DEI legislation are complying with the laws in those states and therefore ending certain kinds of DEI programs. Similarly, colleges and universities are complying with an affirmative action ruling from the Supreme Court. But I think the framing of the question as, hey, look, there's this big higher ed rollback on DEI misses the fact that there's an exogenous force here creating the shift in DEI commitment. The trend line for 15, 20 years in higher education has been steady investment in DEI because demographics are destiny. They're universities and colleges that decide that they want to step back from this are just facing a relevance crisis because the future pipeline of who's going into higher education is increasingly female, low income, first gen, international, like you name it, right? Veteran, adult learner, non-traditional. And so continuing to index on a certain type of student from the 20th century is just it's bad business in higher education. And so I think, again, like noting that there's external forces really driving a lot of this. And I've been burning through the back catalog of HR, Heretics, and I love this podcast. But I do think a lot of times the DEI conversation has been happening in a bit of a vacuum. And what I want to do is try and expand our aperture to include the fact that, and the SHRM mess is such a great example of this, right? And because you asked about it, right? What is SHRM actually responding to here? How could one of the most canonical organizations in HR pull away from equity? And a lot of what's happening is SHRM, as a federal contractor, SHRM is trying to anticipate what might happen in the bigger sort of political milieu. They're stepping back in an attempt to respond to an active campaign, led by really well-funded think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, folks on Twitter, which I agree is a dumpster fire most of the time. But if you look at Chris Rufo or Stephen Miller or any of these guys' threads on Twitter, they're very transparent about what they're doing here, which is let's take anything connected to DEI and load the signal with so much noise that no one can have a coherent conversation about this anymore. And so that, you're at your neighborhood barbecue, you bring up something like inclusion and people say, is that reverse racism thing? Or you bring up ESG and somebody's like, is that woke capitalism? And you're like, where is all this coming from? It's a pretty concerted effort to make it really hard to get into some nuance, get into some context and be tactical with what is really, really hard work to edge organizations towards being meritocratic. I mean, SHRM's abandonment of equity is bananas to me because equity is simply the process of moving towards meritocracy. Without equity, you can't have meritocracy. And you all have done a great job of kind of wrestling with this over the last 6-8 weeks, particularly since Alex's post. But, I think that SHRM really let the HR community down in deciding to back away from courageous leadership. There was a chance here to double down and say, let's just get clarity on what equity is. It's a data-driven, process-based way to advance meritocracy in complex organizations. And that's an easily defensible definition, but they didn't do that.
Hey everyone, we'll be right back in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Your workforce is both your organization's greatest strength and largest single cost. With Planful, it's easy to unlock the secrets of successful workforce planning so you and your HR team can make the right business decisions. Imagine using data-driven insights to develop accurate forecasts, close hiring gaps, and adjust talent acquisition plans collaboratively based on costs today and into the future. Planful lets you collaborate with colleagues in finance to understand the value your employees bring to the table. And the best part, you can get started with Planful in just weeks with minimal help from IT. Plus, with Planful, you get an endless runway. Planful grows with you, no matter how fast or large your team scales. Ready to transform your HR strategy? Join over 1,500 organizations worldwide who trust Planful as their go-to workforce planning software at planful.com/heretics.
Here's a crazy stat. Between hybrid and frontline employees, about 80% don't typically work in an office. So it's no surprise that digitally engaging employees is the #1 concern for CEOs as companies go hybrid. But as hybrid is quickly becoming the norm, it's easy for workplaces to start feeling a little less human. Yet delighting a digital workforce is possible, and it can even be, dare we say, fun. That's where Workvivo, Zoom's employee experience platform, comes in. If you've ever recoiled at the thought of a static intranet that looks like something you built in 1995 using MS Paint, have no fear. Workvivo is a dynamic, intuitive, accessible, and mobile-first tool. People actually like using it, which is why companies like Ryanair, Dollar General, Virgin, and more have rolled it out to hundreds of thousands of employees. Workvivo's activity feeds, spaces, shoutouts, and live streams, among other features, help elevate the employee experience like never before. The result? Dramatically better retention, productivity, and most importantly, connectedness. A greater sense of the belonging we all crave at work, whether we sit at a desk or drive a truck. Make Workvivo the digital heart of your organization and achieve limitless human connection. Head to workvivo.com to book a demo and make sure you tell them that Nolan and Kelly from HR Heretics sent you. I mean, the way that you just described it, I do believe is an easily defensible position. I think the challenge is it started with equality and then it moved into equity. And the definition of equity, as you describe it, is not widely shared amongst the community. And so my understanding as the broad definition of equity is we all start from different places. And so what we need to do is we need to look back at where we started and try and lift people up who started at a place that was lower. And the mechanics of doing that, I think what we're starting to see with businesses, with SHRM even specifically, I do think a lot of it is monetary motivated, to be very clear. But I don't know how you actually take those mechanics and operationalize them if you're a tech company, for example. I don't know how you operationalize it without hampering other folks, apparently potentially from a different gender or race, and put a weight on their ankle. And I think that's where the discussion is today. And so when I hear you say, the removal of equity is bananas, what I hear on my side is like, well, it's actually very hard to operationalize. And didn't we start with equality? And shouldn't equality be the thing that we're focused on?
I mean, I think that so there's some semantics here, right? And that's fine. I think that let me clarify what I mean by equity, right? So when I think about equitable process in the HR space, right? If we look at segments of the employee lifecycle, and when you're looking at unfair or asymmetric friction that certain groups face, a data-driven equity approach is to look at whether an organization has asymmetric headwinds that face certain groups inside that organization, and then to use data and practice to address those headwinds. So there's a nuanced difference here, because what you talked about was adding tailwinds, right? How do we put our finger on the scale and help certain groups? I think that that's become extremely litigious and risky for-profit companies right now. But there's actually an immense amount of work to do. And this is actually in the comments thread that brought us together, Nolan, on LinkedIn. There's so much work you can do with equity overlays in your employee lifecycle just to understand promotion velocity, exit rates for women at Director Plus, equity overlays on your funnel mechanics, right? You're an expert in TA. We know that pass-through rates and funnels are often reflective of bias and noise in our practice, right? And that an equity process is for an early stage organization to move from unstructured interviewing to structured interviewing. Very basic, right? That's an equity investment, because what it does is it removes unfair headwinds from people who are negatively affected by unstructured interviewing, right? And the ways in which affinity bias and, social network recreation creep into the funnel if you don't have structured interviewing, right? So I think some of this is just around semantics. There's a ton of good work to do in organizations that's perfectly legally defensible, that is actually about fairness, equity as a driver of fairness. Because right now, life isn't actually fair, no matter what people want to say. It's not fair in organizations, right? There are still tons of points where inside, the war room, Kelly, you've been CPO many, many times. When you're looking at employee data, you know that there are trends that seem to signal that there's some unfair treatment happening here, or that on our sales teams, there are a certain amount of sales teams where it's not great to be a woman above L4, or whatever it might be. Addressing those asymmetric frictions is equity.
Look, I think, DEIB, I think it's very easy to get confused, right? Generalize what these things mean and actually apply them wrongly, right? I mean, you can kind of understand it, think you're doing things that are causing equity, and it's not really accurate, right? So if we look at equity, providing the same resources and opportunities to everyone, right? If I look at it in a positive light, if I look at it from the offensive, not making sure we're not doing something, but making sure we're doing the same thing for everybody. Doesn't matter what, I go back to like very simple lenses because it's very easy to, again, generalize, misunderstand, confuse these terms. And I've seen HR people actually do things in the organizations that are making it worse, or not making sure that everyone, independent of, has the same resources and opportunities from an equity perspective. So I think if we keep this simple, to your point, Noel, I don't think it should ankle weight anyone. It should remove weights from everyone, And so I don't know. I don't know why they would remove this. I mean, SHRM was the bottom of the list in my mind anyway, and this just made it worse. But it's again this misunderstanding of what these things are, and we muck it all up, in my opinion.
So I hear it sounds like in this group we have alignment, and that doesn't surprise me. But what I'm not hearing is the other side represented, which I tried to represent, which is, Vijay, you use the term semantics. I actually would use the term details. And this is when we start to get into the details. And so, what I am increasingly hearing is not about a fair, meritocratic, standard process that everyone goes through, regardless of race, gender, religious belief, political affiliation, whatever it is. That's not what I'm hearing. What I'm hearing is there's a group of people, specifically around race and gender, that have started at a much more difficult place than another group of people from a specific race and gender. And we need to do more for them in order to help them. That is what is increasing in the conversation today. And so correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I'm hearing a lot more of.
Yeah, I think that when I was getting my thoughts together for our conversation today, I think one of the things that I'm wrestling with, right? So, just to name like that, I'm still working through the mechanics of this myself, is there's a corporate tactical conversation that should be very much around, bodies of practice, evidence-based, investments, what's legal, obviously always, right? And then there's a broader conversation about what are we going to put our finger on the scale of in our society, right? And I think where the data streams get mixed is if we want to have a social justice conversation, I'll give you a different definition of equity. Because when it's about repairing, restoring, and responding to structured exclusion that we could spend the next week talking about, right? Which is inextricable from the fabric of American history. Yeah, at some point in time, you've got to figure out, are we going to edge towards a fully inclusive multicultural democracy or not? That's a bigger social conversation, right? Corporations are way downstream of that conversation. And I think what happened in 2020, not in 2013 with Lean In, but very much in 2020. And you all are both very in the Valley, right? It happened in tech, probably in a more hyperbolic way than anywhere else, is a confusion as to whether we're talking about like DEI for our society, like the promise of an inclusive democracy in America, which does take a form of equity that is about saying, well, what are we going to do with the fact that we're playing a game of Monopoly and half the country didn't get to play for the first 20 roles. And then people got feathered in different rates, after that. And you're going to pretend like everybody can land on Park Place and buy it. And it's not true. And so that's a social conversation. But in 2020, in the kind of technicolor moment in the Valley, especially, I was a chief diversity officer of a publicly held company on its run to a $10 billion market cap. It was a very exciting time. And what I felt inside the room, facing the comp committee of the board, facing the C-suite, was a sudden expansion of the aperture around what the purpose of corporate DEI was. And half of our conversations were actually about, are we doing enough good for society? Half the conversations were about business DEI, right? Like building the roadmap, making sure that we've got the right KPIs in place. What do we need to modify in the tech stack to scale and automate some of this stuff? What is the right ERG playbook for our business? Things like that. Product inclusion. But in 2020, and I would say into 2021, there was still this really vibrant discussion. The board, I would be sitting with the board and they would be going, how can this company do more for society? How much money do we need to spend to expand the total addressable market of future talent that we might not even hire these folks, right? And so using a significant amount of capital, we built a scholarship program in a university it's not like we earned that talent, right? That was simply a service, was a social impact program. That was considered part of the DEI playbook in 2020. 2 years later, right? The numerous headwinds, macroeconomic headwinds, supply shocks, geopolitical, but also litigation headwinds dried up the altruism side of DEI. And what was left was sort of the business rationale. And I think, Nolan, humans don't do well with paradigm shifts, right? Thomas Kuhn's original research on this talks about how when paradigms shift, we actually exist in the old paradigm for a long time. Even before, behaviorally, we're just not good at change. We're in a new paradigm right now where the social purpose form of DEI really is quickly being scrubbed out of business, of profit businesses, particularly publicly held ones. But the discourse hasn't adjusted yet. And the whiplash that I don't feel is acknowledged on HR Heretics enough is if you were an operator in 2020, it feels like I'm on Mars right now because of the types of things we were talking about in 2020 in a publicly held corporation, which is it our duty to fix social ills? Remember Dustin Moskovitz and Conscious Capitalism, Brian Chesky's, shareholder, capitalism. And there was so many different sort of variants on this, right? That conversation blipped out real quick. And I think that we let go of one trapeze bar. We haven't grabbed the next one yet in terms of where the discourse is settling. And I know you've been exploring that.
Hey everyone, we'll be right back in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Real talk, most talent leaders haven't yet cracked how to leverage AI for meaningful impact on their hiring processes and business goals. But the leaders who are effectively using AI to transform their recruiting team's efficiency and quality use Metaview. Metaview is the AI assistant for the interview process. Their AI records and transcribes hiring conversations, like intakes, interviews, and debriefs, then provides perfectly summarized notes of everything that was discussed. That means your people can focus on creating human connections with candidates during calls and save time on the busy work of cleaning up notes after every interview. But it's so much more than just a time saver, because perfect notes means perfect data. For every candidate in every pipeline, hiring teams can make confident, informed decisions, and talent leaders can finally take control of the interview process. Join forward-thinking talent leaders at high-performing organizations like Brex, HelloFresh, and Quora, and check out Metaview. Head over to metaview.ai/heretics to talk to one of Metaview's product experts, or get started for free. You'll be up running and AI-enabled in minutes.
And Vijay, and recently I totally agree with you. So the societal piece has been scrubbed out. And now it seems, at least from the headlines, that the business piece is also being scrubbed out with the cutting of all these teams. So I love both of your take on something that I've been trying to reconcile. And it's like, I remember 4 or 5 years ago, right, DEI leaders, CEOs of companies were saying, and I still believe this work will never end. This work is systematic. This work, even in 20 years, we make progress. We have to go deeper, and there's new evolution. Like, it will never end. And everyone was like, we will always do this. This is important. And now it's like a couple companies cut it. Everyone's cutting it. Like, please reconcile that for me, because you know what I mean?
Yeah, you're totally right, Kelly. And I have
It's
noticed that as well.
hilarious. Like, if you just look at it like a 5-year-old, it's it's disheartening to me that everyone said such things with such fierceness, like we're committed forever, this will never, and then boom,
Can I offer the spicy take on this?
that's why we're here. That's why we're here,
That's
Vijay.
why we're here, right? So, look, I don't have I don't have a conclusion here, but where I am going with this internally, because yeah, when you look at it like a 5-year-old, you're sort of like, wait, but so were you lying 4 years ago? What does that mean? I actually don't think, as individuals, people were necessarily lying. I had some very intensely visceral, closed door conversations with numerous C-suite executives of Fortune 500 companies that were going through a transformation of heart and mind around purpose, around understanding the weight of exclusion in ways that they just hadn't felt before. The switch flipping off so quickly, I think, calls to question whether corporations are the right mechanism to drive social restoration. This is a scope of care dialogue. And actually, this has come up in some of your podcasts in the last, I'd say, 2 months, right? What is in scope for corporations to be dealing with when it comes to employee experience, let alone DEI, right? Because if you're talking to a comp and ben person right now, they're also living in a bit of whiplash. 2-3 years ago, comp and ben was rapidly expanding, right? Like to deal with almost any part of your life, especially in tech, that you were upset with. It's like, hey, we've got a vendor. We can add in more resources. We can keep feathering in more stuff. And I think sometimes the CFO's office was like, this is so weird because for 40 years, we kept the benefits stack really lean. And suddenly we're just yes, 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 yes. And the scope of care of what a corporation was expected to do during COVID. And I think COVID was a real catalyst here that we cannot underrate, right? Like we're talking about social activism and DEI, but COVID actually created perforations in some of the walls around duty of care to your employees that then also seeped into DEI, right? What parts of the human experience are we going to own? And when Wall Street checked tech's legitimacy a year and a half ago and said, look, if you're a SaaS company and you're nowhere near the rule of 40, we're going to start finally holding you accountable to some business fundamentals, right? Then all of a sudden it was like, oh gosh, okay, well, we've got to drive margin and our top line's not growing. And so we're just going to compress OpEx. And what died on the cutting room floor in that calculus between top line and bottom line is, oh yeah, that's that duty of care that momentarily expanded just to talk about like altruism and humanity and the whole person and taking care. You know, we're a family, we're not a workplace. And it's like, I don't know. I think we're actually in a much more real moment around what corporations exist to do. They are phenomenal mechanisms for generating wealth. Our society has to find a way to get involved in fixing these kinds of, really deeply entrenched social inequalities. And I think trying to turn to the private sector to address them, I think what the last 4 years have shown me is that it's too ephemeral. The commitment can disappear overnight based on the market. So we actually need to lean on things that are more long-standing.
I love that, Vijay. The scope of care, Nolan. I've never really talked about it like that. I've never, even in my 24 years in DEI and companies, I've never really had that explicit discussion. What is our scope of care? What are our boundaries? And this goes back to what we've talked about a lot, Nolan, is clarity on who you are and what you stand for. And maybe the scope of care is very wide for an organization, Vijay, but I think a lot of times companies created their scope of care based on what's going on outside of their walls versus being very clear around who they are inside and how that's going to look. And I think that's muddied the waters a lot and created a lot of confusion. And, and I think we've seen this bounce back and forth.
So I agree with both of you, but I want to make sure that we have empathy for the rest of the business as well. And one of my goals with this show is actually, like, we hear this all the time, Kelly, from chief people officers, like, I want a seat at the table. And I think a big reason why we often don't feel that way is because we make challenges as they are from the HR team bigger than the challenges of the rest of the business. So we've been talking about this pendulum shift and this paradigm shift. Well, I mean, if I said this, in today's show that launched, is think about the rest of the business. I mean, they're also dealing with the Wall Street changes. they're dealing with budget cuts, they're dealing with AI, they're dealing with layoffs too. So I think we do ourselves a disservice in HR when we only navel gaze and we don't include the other areas of the business and we act like it's harder on us than it is on them. So I'll start there. The next thing I'll say is we have data.
Can I opine on what you just said and point out, because you've done a good job of being really consistent about this, right? About saying like, hey, HR, like obviously this show comes from a place of love. You're both HR practitioners and you're trying to do a good job being like, where is the whining not acceptable? and I love that. That's an important accountability raiser and balance. I'll offer an example of what I think is actually pretty singular and exceptional. And please counter if you disagree. When I've watched organizations that I've been on the inside of get excited about AI, and they've hired some sort of an AI czar or a machine learning or a blockchain czar or anything, a Web3 czar, anything in the last 4 or 5 years that was like very zeitgeisty, very in the moment, that czar was given wide berth to go to all of the elements of the business and go, if we're going to crack blockchain, we need to change this, 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 and this. And people were told, yeah, okay, I gotta do this. The number of chief diversity officers you can bring onto your show where the organization did not till the soil at all to get ready for DEI. Overnight was like, oh, we're going to do this. Let's go out and hire a person or some people. Let's create some liquidity, a budget line. And then the DEI person came in and everyone, including the chief people officer, was like, so are you going to make this work? It don't work like that, right? So then you go, okay, well, fine. I need to have a plan to address everything from hiring. You go to the head of TA. Hey, we need to make these kinds of changes and slow down here until we get compositional mix and top of funnel on these kinds of key searches, blah, blah. And the head of TA goes, no.
I'm with you. I'm with you, but that's a shared responsibility, Vijay, right? That's a shared responsibility. It absolutely is a shared responsibility to where if that person is interviewing and what I would describe, the way I would describe what you're saying is a rug pull. And if a rug pull happens, I'm fully with you. But what I think is more happening is these professionals are coming in, the job sounds great, but they haven't done their diligence. They haven't gotten to the lowest level of detail in the interview to actually scenario play. Well, when this thing happens, well, what about when the business pulls back? What are we going to do? And again, maybe there are situations where that has been the case. I don't believe that is what's happening at a broad-based level. The other thing I would say, and where I was going, is every aspect of the business, especially in today's world, but just as historically, is always under a microscope for ROI. And we look at data. You've been mentioning data a bunch in this conversation. I think that's very healthy. That there has been investment. There have been people put on this problem. And then what ends up happening is the data doesn't move. Things don't change. At least that's what businesses are saying right now. And it absolutely reflected in the rest of the business is when you bring in a new sales leader and numbers either don't improve or go down, that person's going to get terminated. And I think that that's more of what's happening here. I do think it's more of brass tacks of like, well, we haven't seen change. We thought we would make this investment and things would be better. And that hasn't been the case.
Okay, well, let's granularize this notion that things didn't get better, right? So let's say rough math, about a third of Fortune 500 companies publish some form of transparent demographic data. And if you do a 10-year look back or a 5-year look back, depending on how long that data has been available, the trend line is up and to the right for the kinds of inclusion that they were going for. So if you look at, you all play heavily in tech, but if you look at Salesforce, you look at Microsoft, the trend line is up and to the right. There's major double-digit gains of women's representation across the organization, even at Director Plus, at VP Plus. Microsoft, industry leader in this. So there are examples of improvement in this space. There's, so there's that side of things. On the flip side, though, bring some integrity and some data to this. Out of the Fortune 1000 companies, less than half have any visibility into their demographic data. So when people say things haven't gotten better, I'm interested in what database they're using to understand that lack of progress, because we are operating off of anecdote frequently, right? With no data transparency, it's very difficult to tell whether things are getting better or not. And there's a huge amount of companies that just don't report, right? Who's in what roles and whether they've made progress or not. So this is difficult. It's difficult to get clean signal on this. I think that the question of whether things got better or not is somewhat based on whether companies, and so it's interesting, Nolan, because partly what you did in your last answer is you're like, look, I think it's on the DEI leader's fault if the company commitment isn't there because they didn't diligence the role enough. I'm not sure. I think that that's tough. That's a tough sell because there's the vast majority, and this was big in tech, especially Kelly, I'd be interested in your experience here. The vast majority of companies that pursued any kind of DEI commitment in the last, let's say 5 years, went heavy on hiring, way less focus on equity and inclusion. Equity and inclusion came a far second in terms of where the dollars and the calories went. And part of the challenge around progress here is that many companies had a revolving door, right? Of bringing people in and those folks voting with their feet and going, this isn't a good experience. I don't want to be here. I don't feel good on my team, or my team leader has no skills to manage someone different than themselves, yada, 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 right? And so I think a huge mistake is tactical, but it doesn't obviate the philosophical commitment to DEI. Like the mistakes in tactics are found in every discipline, right? I mean, look at blockchain, tons of mistakes made. Do people use that to then say, well, this whole thing is bunk, or the space race, right?
There's many people do say that about blockchain. I actually think that that's absolutely, that is what a lot of people say is like, when we look at this and we look at the data of how much investment went into blockchain, for example, and the ROI on the investment, I think many people say that for sure.
And now they're starting to say it about AI. So that's hilarious.
I agree. This is my point. It comes down to the investment and the ROI. And Vijay, just to steelman your side, you're exactly right that the metrics have moved in some of these larger companies. The question is the impact on the business. That's very hard to measure. That is very, very hard to measure. And so I think that's the other side of this is like some of it is unmeasurable. Now, I will say anecdotally, from an inclusive standpoint, I've told the story on the show before. Like my mom, when I was 8 or 9 years old, got fired because I had chickenpox, and she had to stay home and help me. And so, like, I will say that's not fully eradicated from society, but we have made significant gains as it relates to like taking care of your family, careship, those sorts of things. And I would also say we've made significant gains in the way that we interact. It is imperfect. Humans are imperfect, but I believe we should always be striving for improvement. And especially as it relates to inclusivity and how we interact with each other, where I get scared is this over reliance on immutable traits and metrics associated with immutable traits. That does worry me, because when we're only focused on those things, that's where the scale tipping conversation comes in. And that's where a lot of the conversation has gone in this country.
I want to respond to this, but Kelly, I think you were trying to get in. So if you want to jump in, and I'll
Go ahead. Then I'll jump in, Vijay.
2 thoughts. One, I'm sorry to hear about what happened when you were a kid, and it is glaring. It's a real like glaring sign of how much has changed, right? Around family leave, the kinds of rights employees have versus what our parents went through. My parents immigrated to North America in the 1960s, and labor conditions that my dad describes in the 70s and 80s was brutal, right? Now, the gestalt, right? The movement over time towards increased dignity at work didn't happen idiosyncratically. It didn't happen spontaneously. It happened because of social forces pushing for work to be better and to treat people better. So just a poignant reminder that nothing gets better unless we put our finger on the scale. Nothing, right? I mean, like organizations generally don't drift towards humanity. They drift towards margin. So, we've got to find a way to put our finger on the scale. Your point about immutable traits, I think that this is the tricky part here, right? Immutable traits are absolutely a demarcation line of the way people experience life in our society. So again, when you say like, look, corporate DEI, it's really tough to focus on immutable traits. I think we've got to figure out then, like between social restoration, where immutable traits like race or class, like the zip code you're born into, which often correlates with race in our society because of redlining and housing segregation and a variety of historical forces, that has a huge bearing on your life arc, right? I mean, like in the wealthiest country in the world, when the zip code you're born in over determines your outcomes, it's a huge problem in the society. And those the arc of your experience being so affected by immutable traits shows up in the DEI conversation. The question then is, I think that you're trying to ask is, what parts of the DEI conversation are relevant to a for-profit corporation, a tech company? I think that there's real stickiness and firm ground around inclusion and high performance teams. Right. So, like, Kelly, you've brought this up before, right? As I burned through the catalog of HR Heretics, right? When you're trying to put your finger on, like, where can we find the business ROI of anything in the DEI space? In tech companies, I think that team effectiveness, the team is the unit of performance as you scale, right? If you're 100-person, like pre-seed, whatever, then it's a bunch of ICs. But as you scale and you've got 1,000, 5,000 people, or you're big, the team becomes the unit of performance, right? And so for me, high performance teams becomes this real edge where the whole behavioral science of inclusion, you can take something like belonging, talk about it through a DEI lens, or you can talk about it through the human need we have as Homo sapiens to belong. And you can skill a leader to lead for belonging and unlock as an outcome resilience. To me, that has a lot of business ROI associated with it.
Yeah. I just talked to someone last week and I got pretty hot on the topic because this obsession with measuring, and you said, to your point, Nolan, it's very hard to measure the ROI. And I just got kind of annoyed because I've said this so many times. I love a good metric. I love data. I also think one of the biggest forces that impacts a P&L is things that you can't put a number on. It's a vibe, it's an ethos, it's a feeling. It is that magic that happens when great people come together and support each other. And that is essentially a lot of the I and the B in this. You get to that through a lot of the D and E work. Like, it's just, it makes me a little irritable when everything has to be measured. And there was an obsession about that. Remember, Vijay, like the last 10 years, an obsession. And the easiest thing you can measure is immutable traits and hiring in, especially in the heyday when people are fucking hiring 800, 1,000 people a year. And I've said it even out of my own mouth. The best way to move the pie charts is through mass hiring and measuring this stuff. And everyone got obsessed with measuring the representation. And again, I told all CEOs this, like, the invisible thing that will impact your P&L more than equal or more than a lot of other things is the people that are in your organization, how they're feeling, how they're working together, how they're working. And that is the invisible glacier that can, like, accelerate you or sink or stall you. And there's not enough appreciation for that.
I agree, Kelly. I strongly agree with you. And on the point of vibe, right? I think just to steel man the side of the companies that have gone away from this, what I have heard interacting with some of these C-level leaders is that it became more divisive than it was we're all rowing in the same direction. I candidly believe, you mentioned Alexander earlier, Vijay. So, like, let's get into that. So Scale AI CEO Alexander Wang came out with the MEI policy, and that's obviously gone way bigger than I initially expected because it didn't seem that crazy to me. But I would love to get your take on this. But what I read into that, is that the over focus on DEI was exactly going antagonistically to what you're describing, Kelly. It wasn't improving the vibe. It was creating camps of people versus having everybody in it together to win. And so, Vijay, I'm curious to get your take on that.
It's so interesting where corporate conversation reflects the social conversation, right? So, Nolan, the thing you just said has been part of workplace discussions I've had for over 20 years. Because if you work in education, there's this question of, is the gift of multiculturalism the tossed salad or the melting pot? Do you remember some of the conversations in the 90s, right? And so as we allow people to be who they want to be, how do we deal with the need for there to be a unified whole? there's useful academic work on this, right? There's a theory called the theory of optimal distinction, where there's a parabolic arc between how differentiated a group is and how satisfied they are in the group experience. If the group gets too differentiated, satisfaction actually drops. If the group isn't allowed to differentiate at all, satisfaction also drops. And that's where you see it like a true, bell curve parabolic arc, where there is a sweet spot where there's enough differentiation that people can be who they want to be, but there's also enough shared meaning, value, goal, ethic, purpose, profit motive, whatever it is, RSUs, to actually then give you cohesion. Cohesion is jet fuel for the team, right? Cohesion is jet fuel for the company. So as we think about this dance and the science of high performing teams, what often is missing in the C-suite is the right dashboard, right? So when people say, oh, diversity is leading to fragmentation, look, homogenous teams might offer the illusion of an easy on-ramp to cohesion. And you do see it. You see it in early stage startups, right? 30, 40, 50 people in a room. They're super homogenous, right? Because of, what O&A folks would call a network homophily, right? We tend to hire people exactly like us. You all have been great about naming this on your show. Kelly, I know you regularly double click on this, right? But when you look at those organizations, they actually get the benefit of homogenous teams, which is they can move really quickly. They share a language, they share a form of intelligence, going back to Alex's thing about we're going to hire for intelligence. Which intelligence? Whose intelligence? There's a lot of different intelligences out there. But when you have 40, 50 people that are all very similar, you can move super fast. You can communicate in these shorthands. And if you've ever been in that kind of an environment, it feels like you're on like the 96 Bulls, right? But there are so many fractures and fissures around the downside of that homogeneity, right? You're missing some of the complexity that can actually help someone on the team go, hey, before we release this next thing, have you ever thought that this might actually land poorly on the audience or whatever it might be? There's some obvious benefits to friction, and the friction that comes from difference does slow things down. It can cause fracturing. The question is, are you going to skill your team leaders to be able to harness the diversity on the team to be productive? If you don't, there's a ton of research that supports your thesis, Nolan, that a poorly managed diverse team underperforms against a poorly managed homogenous team. It's easier to lead a homogenous team. It's harder to lead a diverse team. And so when organizations committed to diversity hiring, to go back to the foibles here, right? When we actually work to rapidly diversify the workforce and we do not deal with manager effectiveness, managers end up doing a really bad job with teams that are sitting here going, well, we think and communicate so differently about this set of problems based on the fact that we have very different lived experiences, that we sit in different geographies, that we sit in different time zones and cultures. And so in some ways, the promise of diversity, Kelly, you said this, only unlocks with the catalyst of inclusion. And that's so basic.
And then what happens, right? That's like running around with scissors. Then what happens is you actually cause more divisiveness because the frustration seeps in because you're not bringing them together. And then those folks, I'm just playing this out, right? They go to their affinity group meetings. They're venting, rightly so, and it causes more divisions. So I have one last question for you, Vijay, and it's built on this. Is I believe that how well this shows up in an organization or how it doesn't, right? It causes divisiveness. The programs that are out there make people farther apart versus together is how this is set up, right? Not from the DEI leader. This isn't a fucking like sales leader, Nolan. This isn't someone who can kind of pull strings and make money and get fired because they're not meeting goals. This person is a lot of times at the mercy of the organization and how much these people get it, because they can't do this work effectively unless everyone in the organization is with them and they're doing it effectively. So it's not like just a plug and play sales leader that you can make money or not make money. If the organization doesn't get it, this person is toast. Like they're not going to be successful. But it takes me to and you said it earlier, Vijay, what is the next trapeze bar, right? If you had a magic wand, if you had a magic 8 ball, like what would you either create or what do you see? Because I do think, and I've said this in former shows, we are in the middle of like the page turning to the next chapter. I just don't think anyone really knows what that is. And I'm just wondering if you had, again, a magic wand or an 8 ball, what
Sorry, and just before you respond, Vijay, I just want to quickly say I don't think my last point was well heard, which is I don't believe it's about diversity being I actually think there's plenty of data to support that diverse teams have better outcomes. I am completely with you on everything that you just said. I think it's programmatically, how do we try and achieve that is causing the divisiveness, which goes into Kelly's question.
Fair, fair. Thanks for doubling back on that, Nolan. And it's important to get that framed correctly. So we're, a couple of next trapeze bars I see where there's a huge firefight happening around DEI in our society. Some corporations are using this as a full chance to jettison, but actually many aren't. I'm engaged broadly with HR leaders across, and I know that we're heavy on tech in this discussion, but I work in manufacturing, consumer goods, transportation, energy, and there are many sectors that are slower and quieter about their investment in DEI that are actually now in the face of all the fracturing that's happening. They're actually investing for a whole set of different reasons, but I do think that potentially some maturation of the DEI program can come out of the friction that we're going through right now. A couple of examples. I think a lot of organizations are looking at ERGs right now and going, okay, we get that ERGs can be an engine of belonging for specific groups that find themselves struggling with being the only on their team, right? And so the loneliness of onlyness is a real thing. If you've ever been the only one on your team, it's difficult to do the best work of your life. And so it's helpful to have one space you can go to feel normal, recharge your battery, go back to your team, do good work. I mean, this is the basic science of why affinity groups drive better performance. But there are so many next steps in the ERG roadmap that are actually about business ROI. So how do we see ERGs as places where we can actually get advice on product inclusion and product relevance based on new demographic markets we're trying to go after, or product inclusion for people with disabilities? When I was at VMware, there was a strong synergy between the disability awareness ERG, which had a very, very strong representation of people with disabilities in it, and the product inclusion team that was looking at very, very high-tech products like vSphere and trying to make sure that there was really strong accessibility tech built into VMware's core stack. There's the ways to think about ERGs in terms of talent strategy. And Nolan, you might have been doing this at DoorDash, right? But when you level up into level 2, level 3 ERG playbooks, then your ERGs are helping you with activations, helping you actually bring a value case to your future talent pipeline around the value of working at that company. And the way that ERGs can testify about employee experience is far more powerful for employer brand than marketing can, because it's going to, conferences and other kinds of activations and being able to say, look, I have a great experience here as a woman engineer, yada, yada, yada. So there's, the movement towards saying, well, in what ways for the context of each business, and that's different in each business, can we take something like ERGs and move up the maturity curve towards business ROI? And there's a forcing function, I think, driving a long overdue maturation of that. I think in other areas, I think the work on teams, I have a book coming out this fall on high performing teams, where I've taken a lot of the behavioral science that I used to use every day as a DEI person and deployed it agnostically as this is how people do amazing work. If you lead in these ways, if you turn up the volume on trust, belonging, and connection, your team will be better at navigating endless disruption, right? And there's a ton of behavioral science evidence to that. And so I get really strong uptick from HR audiences around like, great, thanks for giving us a radically simplified approach to taking something like psychological safety, refactoring it as trust, deploying it at the team level in a set of practical skills that are not being pushed through the lens of identity, but rather being pushed through the lens of performance. So I think that that's part of the shift.
Yep. And I don't know about you both. I've seen a push for DEI teams to lead, to own, and or be a part of organizational effectiveness or talent management teams because of that reason.
That's right. And that goes back to Kelly, the point you've made previous times, right? Inclusion can actually be a guarantor or a driver, not a guarantor, but a driver or a catalyst in the kinds of performance mechanics, team cohesion, team resilience, innovation, ideation outcomes. And so I think that's the next step is that paradigm shift, successfully grabbing the next rung on the trapeze and learning to communicate about DEI, not from the sense of social purpose. If you're in a for-profit, particularly a publicly held for-profit, but learning to communicate about this around the individual, team, and organizational ROI.
I agree.
Vijay, what would you say to the, I think, growing group of people who aspire to, and have been using even the MLK quote around, he has a dream that his 4 children will be able to live in a nation that will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And so I wonder about this in business, because I do think it has gotten to this divisive level. And this is the conversation today, is like, should the goal be around blindness for race, religion, and politics? Is that our North Star?
Wow, Nolan, ending on a very light, facile point. Actually, look, the King quote about color of skin versus content of character has been brought up for 40 years now around what I would say is a malappropriation of the quote to justify colorblind social policy that actually hurts communities of color. That's in the social sphere. Inside a corporation, so, again, trying to distinguish here between socially restorative DEI for public policy and corporate DEI business strategy. Inside a corporation, one, I think you're legally required to try and address, protected classes and discrimination. And so you should be trying to create an environment in which people are actually treated based on their individual performance. And here's the reason Alex's MEI framework landed like a flaming turd on so many people's sensibilities is because we are so far from that in human organizations. The level at which bias and noise infects every aspect of talent attraction, talent acquisition, talent evaluation, promotion. I mean, it's rampant. And I think any honest conversation would have to name that these are really imperfect systems that are about the humans and the scaling of human errors and decision making across human networks. And so when you take that kind of a network theory view on this, then what we know is that we need some sort of an intervention to actually make it so that people's immutable factors are not limiting their ability to function. And so like DEI, if you want to even incrementally edge towards King's vision, then you can't do it without DEI. The flaw in Alex's reasoning is that you can abandon inclusion and equity and somehow reach meritocracy. And it just doesn't math out for me here, because our starting place right now is so topographically uneven.
I completely agree.
And this is where the details come in. So look, Vijay, this has been an awesome conversation. I do appreciate you engaging in the conversation in a good faith manner. I know that these are very tough, but our commitment to our audience is to engage, to try and bring different perspectives into the conversation. So I really appreciate you coming on the show and getting to this level of conversation with us.
Thank you, Vijay.
Yeah, it's been great being here. I've learned a lot preparing for today and having the conversation with the two of you. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. HR Heretics, it's a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Econ 102, Moment is Zen, and Turpentine VC. Subscribe, 5 stars, share it on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, all the things.